let's talk about Spring Boot. So what is Spring Boot? Is Spring Boot a different framework? Well, many beginners would think that Spring Boot is different from Spring. So using Spring Boot, they're not using Spring Framework. Well, that's not true. Spring Boot is an extension of the Spring Framework. That is, under the table, Spring Boot is using Spring Framework. Then why do we need Spring Boot? What benefit does Spring Boot offer us? It offers several productivity enhancements. So that means it is developer friendly. It will save developer a lot of time. So by having Spring Boot, we're not making Spring more powerful per se. We're simply just making developers' life much easier and happier. Okay, then what problem does Spring Boot solve? Well, Spring Framework is great. It helps manage all the beans and auto-wire them together, right? But there is one small problem though. So this is life. We're using Spring Framework to solve a problem, okay? But introducing Spring Framework also introduce other problems, okay? So we have to keep fixing those problems. Here's the problem. As a developer, you have to tell Spring how to wire those beans together and how to configure each bean so Spring knows how to create them correctly. Let me show you an example. If we are using Hibernate in the project, and we know that you can not just download Hibernate jar and throw it into your class path and use it in Spring. No, you have to configure it. You have to tell Hibernate where is your database, what is the size of connection pool, and where are my domain objects, so on and so forth. And how to tell Spring? By using XMLs. So take a look at this picture here. Now this is a very typical non-Spring Boot Spring project. In other words, you're using Spring without using Spring Boot. And you have to define those dozens of XMLs. And those are not for developers. Those are written by developers to tell Spring how to configure the beans. And configuring a Spring application usually takes half a day because you have to write all those XML files. So Spring Boot comes to save your life. So the most well-known enhancement Spring Boot brings in Spring Framework is something called Autoconfiguration, where Spring Boot can make reasonable guesses of what components or beans need to be configured and wired together based on the entries in the class path. And some people call this Opinionated defaults configuration or sensible defaults. Let's use our Hibernate as an example again. Let's say you want to use Hibernate in Spring Boot. All you need to do is tell Spring Boot, hey, Spring Boot, I'm going to use Hibernate. Please give me all the sensible defaults or the defaults that you think is the best practice. And boom, you can use it with no configuration. Well, no configuration by yourself, but there are Spring Boot's default configuration. Well, personally, I think this makes a lot of sense. When you use Hibernate, how do you configure it? You probably will go online, Google it, and go to Stack Overflow and see how most people use Hibernate and use their configurations. That's right. That actually inspires Spring Boot team that says, why not we prepare some sensible defaults or opinionated default configurations for each library. So when people want to use them, they can just use those default configurations. If they want to change it, feel free to change. But the default will be enough for most beginners and most projects. But this is very similar to when you install a software on Windows, right? You download the package and you just click next, next, next. You use defaults all the way along. But if you're an expert, you want to change something, they also give you this opportunity to change. That's the spirit of Spring Boot. They will try to minimize the configuration that a developer needs to do and try to give you those sensible defaults. So you are very lucky that there is Spring Boot because developing in a non-Spring Boot Spring project is very painful. It takes a lot of time to write all those configurations by yourself. So in summary, Spring Framework makes Java application development easier. Spring Boot makes developing a Spring application simpler.